Kלים Perik Chafalaf Mishnah Gimel. This is the last Mishnah of this Perik. This Perik has dealt with complicated, I would say, machines. For instance, we started off with the loom, then we went on to the oil and the machresha, the yoke and the plough. Now we're going to other forms of chibur, of kelim, where we have different components and we're discussing the chibur of the different components. What's important to know about this Mishnah is that the various chiburim that we're going to encounter in this Mishnah are not permanent chiburim. In other words, they weren't there originally, the original manufacture, or they weren't put on later to be there permanently. Because in such a case, if something is made permanently, always to be there, part of the chibur, part of the machine, it's always a chibur. We're talking about, as we were in previous Mishnah, things which are detachable. When you need to do the job, you then assemble the keli and put it together, and it's that type of chibur we're talking about. And we're starting off with a saw. Hanegea biyad magera mikan or mikan tome. You have a saw, and instead of having one handle, one end of the saw like we have today, the Mishnah's saw is the saw is here, and then you have two handles at each end sticking up. So you hold the saw like this on each handle, and you saw like that. Those hands, those yodos, are classic yodos, and when they are mechubet, says the Mishnah, if the saw is tomei and you touch one of the hands, one of the yodos on either side, then you are tomei. That's a classic chibur. But sometimes, and in addition to these hands, to these handles, there are other bits stuck on, and that's what we're going to deal with the next bit of the Mishnah. And these bits are not called a chibur. The first four are to do with a saw. B'chut uv'meshicha b'amo uv'snifin. You've got the saw. You've got your two handles sticking up. That's fine. But then, in order to keep the handles firm, you sometimes then use a chut and a meshicha, a thread or a string, across from one handle to the other handle. You put a chut and a meshicha across to keep the thing firm and taut. They, says the Mishnah, are not a chibur. Amma. So you have your handles, then you have across the top a string or a thread. The amma is across the middle, halfway up between the two handles. You have your chut and meshicha on the top, and then you have an amma, a piece of wood called an amma, again joining the two handles. That's also not a chibur. Snifin, after you've put your amma and your chut and meshicha across, you then have cross sections, little pieces of wood, vertical, which join the saw to the amma, and then on the next level up to the chut and the meshicha. Those little pieces of wood which are put in there to keep the chut and meshicha and the amma straight are not a chibur to the saw. Next case, b'machbe shel charosh. This was a vice, a press used by a carpenter. You have two pieces of wood to press the thing you're trying to hold. But these pieces of wood are joined by a metal screw, a detachable metal screw. The Mishnah is saying that if the metal screw is tomei, then the actual machbesh, the pieces of wood, the flat pieces of wood which go up and down and press the thing in between, are not a chibur. Similarly, of a kastanis tahor. Kastanis, you have an awl, which is a sharp instrument to make a hole in a piece of wood. But to make a hole, you've got to work quite hard twisting. So what they did was, you have your awl, you then have a piece of wood, the form of a bow, the form of a keshes, and you attach your awl into the middle of this bow, and then instead of twisting the awl, you just have to twist the bow like this, round and round. That chibur of the keshes, of the bow, the arc, to the actual awl is not called a chibur, it's tahor. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af hanegea b'malbein shel masar hagodol tahor. Masar hagodol is an enormous industrial saw used for cutting logs. It's so big that 4 people have to operate it. So you set this big saw inside an enormous wooden frame. And then 4 people at each corner of the frame actually help push and pull the saw so that it cuts the wood. Again, we're talking about the chibur of the frame to the saw. It's detachable. It's not called a chibur. Touching the malbein when the masar is tummy does not make you tummy. Mishnah is moving on now to arrows. Sorry, to the bow. When you have a bow to shoot an arrow, you have the actual bow, the hard bit, the firm bit, and then you have what's called a bow string. You set the arrow which you want to shoot at the back of the bowstring. You hold the bow, and you hold the bowstring back, putting the arrow onto the bowstring. Says the Mishnah, if the arrow is tomei, then touching any part of the bow, either the yeser, which is the bowstring, or bekeshes, or the actual bow, afal pi shehu mesucha, even though the bow, the arrow, is actually on the bowstring and it's been stretched back, waiting to be shot. Even at that stage, the arrow is not a chibur to the yeser and the keshes. And if the arrow is tomei, touching the yeser and keshes will leave you tahor. The Mishnah finishes off with something called mitzudas ishus tahira. Tahira is a little rodent called a mole, and you have a trap. This trap has a metal arrow, a detachable metal arrow, so when the mole falls in, slams shut and pins the thing and probably kills it. Says the Mishnah, the chibur of the arrow to the mitzuda is tahor, because it's not a proper chibur. Rav Huda Omer says no. Kolzman shi metucha chibur. If the thing is actually poised, the arrow is actually in the trap and it's poised, waiting. The trap is being pulled back, and the arrow is waiting to shoot the mole, then that is a chibur. There's a chibur of the arrow to the mitzuda. Not an easy parak to understand. The mitzvah